Welcome to another exciting episode of Deterrence Down Under, a podcast dedicated to Australia and the challenges of deterrence in the Indo-Pacific region. Deterrence Down Under is part of the National Institute for Deterrence Studies podcasting network, where we strive to promote peace, foster strategic stability, and help you to think deterrence. Just a friendly reminder that the opinions expressed by our hosts and guests are their own and don't necessarily reflect any institution with which they may be affiliated. G'day from Canberra. We hope you enjoyed the show.
Hey, welcome to Deterrence Down Under. I'm your host, Carl Rhodes.
Hey, I'm Christine Leah.
And I'm Natalie.
Hey, today we're going to debate amongst the Australian triad here the state of extended nuclear deterrence in Australia. So extended nuclear deterrence, it's a tricky problem. It's hard enough to deter an attack on one's own nation. If you're trying to deter an attack on your allies and partners, that's even tougher. So we're going to dive into this and see what extended deterrence means for Australia. And we're going to walk back in history to 2012. And that's the start of the U.S. pivot to the Pacific. And 2012 was also the time where a younger Christine Leah was a freshly minted PhD and writing quite a bit on this topic. So we're going to take a look at her thoughts from then and fast forward to today and see what's changed and where we stand today in terms of extended nuclear deterrence for Australia. So first, the deterrence news from Australia here. A little short piece of news that everyone's latched onto from 12 June. That the Pentagon is conducting a review into AUKUS, being led by Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Elbridge Colby. So supposedly this review is looking into whether AUKUS fits into the Trump administration's America First agenda. Now, what that means or what the actual guidelines for the review are very unclear. Although there will be a meeting. So today's the 17th of June. There'll probably be a meeting between Prime Minister Albanese and President Trump in the next day or two that may lay out some of the findings from this review. I imagine that AUKUS will be a point of discussion between them. Much of Australia's defense modernization is really focused on getting these conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarines. And so any change to that, everyone suddenly starts to either panic or say, stay calm. And so there's a great interest here in what's going to happen with that review, but little consensus from the experts on what the review may mean. Is it just keep calm and carry on? Or is it, we need to panic and come up with a plan B, or somewhere in between? You can read a piece on each of those different viewpoints in the press right now. So getting started, let's dive back into our primary topic, extended nuclear deterrence. So, Christine, I parked a DeLorean time machine into your driveway. I want you to get into it, travel 88 miles per hour, and go back to 2012. And let's take a look at what Australia was thinking about extended nuclear deterrence at that time. So, over to you, Christine.
Hey, thanks, Carl. And stoked to be talking about this topic. It actually all started about 15 years ago. I was thinking about PhD topics, and I wanted to write about kind of the history of deterrence in the Asia Pacific with regards to nuclear weapons. And then my professor at the time, Hugh White, said, why don't you focus on Australia? And I thought, Australia? Well, that's interesting. And he showed me some work by a scholar at MIT, Jim Walsh, who had done some initial research in the Australian National Archives. And it turns out he and Wayne Reynolds uncovered that Australia had a nuclear weapons program from the late 40s until the early 1970s. And so I built further on that work, and I was looking at the history of us Australian thinking about extended deterrence, because whilst Australia wanted to have its own nuclear weapons capability, at the same time, and it preferred to have US assurances of extended nuclear deterrence, but it wasn't really able to secure any concrete guarantees other than vague statements that, Australia is part of the ANZUS alliance and so forth. But from the late 50s to the early 1970s, because Australia was in this period of what William Walker terms nuclear disorder, at the time, Australia had been bombed during the Second World War by the Japanese. Conventional war was seen as a real possibility. Nuclear weapons were seen as just bigger and better conventional weapons. There wasn't this sort of uniqueness about them. There was a perception that these would just become a more normal feature of the international security environment. There was kind of no norm against proliferation or their use. There was no NPT at the time, even though that was being negotiated, but there wasn't sort of any formal arms control with regards to nuclear or conventional weapons. And Australia saw communist China and Indonesia as being immediate threats to its existence. And so Australia was trying to get guarantees of, this extended deterrence business, what does that actually mean? Can you clarify when and where you might use nuclear weapons in the defense of Australian troops operating in Vietnam at the time as well, or in the defense of our nation? So it's a fascinating history, and it's really not well known, unfortunately. And I think, so I was looking at that back in, I finished up in 2012, but I argued back then, because I was seeing kind of this new era of nuclear disorder coming into play, which I think we've entered into again. And one of my recommendations was, well, given that China may well be a major threat to Australia again, and all these things are happening in the region, and the test of extended nuclear deterrence has become much more regional rather than global, with the kind of superpower rivalry between Russia and the United States. I argued that Australia should seek greater assurances and establish, like Japan and with South Korea, a formal, publicly announced extended deterrence dialogue. And I stand by that recommendation.
Very interesting. Very interesting. And you think the main threat was Indonesia and China at the time. Was there any thought about the Soviet Union back in the 50s to 70s? I mean, was that also a concern? And was Australia's nuclear weapon program focused on that?
So, I mean, I'm not making any of this up. This is all in the National Archives. It's very well documented. It's all published in my book and Wayne Reynolds' work. It was definitely the communist Chinese regime at the time, and also President Sukarno in Indonesia was conducting his konfrontasi against Malaysia, for instance. So the perception was that these countries were threats to Australia at the time, before Australia had better intelligence about the actual military capabilities later on. It's very interesting because there was a lot of concern about Western Europe, but the Soviet Union wasn't perceived as a direct threat to Australia. It was more like, in terms of the global world order, sort of thing.
So Christine, sorry to interrupt, but we now know that in the 60s, Indonesia had approached China for a nuclear weapons program as well. When I've spoken to this with Paul Dibben and Richard Braben-Smith, they said that the intelligence at the time, they weren't aware of this because obviously they were in that area. But in your searches through the archives, do you have any record of that too?
I actually do, yes. There was some concern that Indonesia might acquire nuclear weapons. And I've got this fantastic quote by an Australian diplomat, because Sukarno had I think one of his senior advisors, Dr. Subandrio, he was one of the proponents of Indonesia acquiring nuclear weapons and for all nations to have nuclear weapons. There's a superb quote. Again, Australian diplomat. I am cabling, this is a DFAT, at the time it was the Department of External Affairs. I am cabling in clear Subandrio's comments on the desirability of all nations possessing nuclear weapons. Under the pressure of local power politics, I fear that the wily doctor has gone a little mad. The Italian ambassador today referred to Sukarno as El Duce Indonesia, with a slight stink of the French. While this comment is a little naughty, it is rather close to home.
Wow. That's a good piece of history right there. So if we jump to 2012, what was the situation then? At this point, the United States is doing their pivot to the Pacific because of increased threat. What was Australia's view at that time, and how would you compare it to today? Is there a big change? Do you see the threat environment getting worse? I mean, there's a lot of talk in strategic documents about the worst strategic environment since the 1930s in Australian defense thinking. So I appreciate your thoughts there, looking back to 2012 and looking to today and seeing some of the challenges.
Oh, cheers, mate. Well, I think at the time, it's hard to say the Australian view, right? But I remember I was at, just finishing up at the Australian National University, and I had my main supervisors were Hugh White and Desmond Ball, and I think kind of the belligerent actions of China in the South China Sea at the time were beginning. Being a historian and kind of thinking historically, I thought, well, this is not very surprising, and this is going to continue and get much worse, I think, if you look at trends in history. So my position was that things are only going to get worse. And then 2014, you see Russia annexing Crimea, and there's all this hubbub. It's like, oh, major power war can happen. I'm like, yes, it can happen. The 90s was an aberration in history. Don't be surprised. So my view was that the Asia-Pacific region is in for quite a rough future. But I think most Australians, because we are the lucky country, and we're not that historically minded compared to Europe or the Asian nations indeed. I think this is slowly... What's the analogy of a frog in the boiling pot of water?
The frog in the boiling water. So the water slowly gets hotter, and the frog doesn't notice it, and eventually is boiled. Now, I've heard in reality the frogs are actually smart enough to jump out once they start to feel pain, but it's a good analogy in terms of how to think about the slowly rising threats.
But I think you, Carl, as well, you now that you've lived in Australia for a bit, you're becoming more familiar with Australian strategic culture, and I don't think there's the same, what you might call, maturity in thinking about great power war and the possibility that Australia could be involved again in such circumstances.
I've got a really interesting photo of all of my family at a wedding, and they're all in war uniforms. So the history's there, but I don't know if you can see that on camera because I can't see it. But yeah.
We'll imagine it.
There we go.
No, there it is. There it is.
So everyone in the photo, and this is on my dad's side, and everyone's dressed up in their war uniforms because that's what was happening.
Wow.
Yeah. But I do think there is a difference in terms of kind of the Cold War and the impact on Americans versus Australians. And, Americans were, we got trained to duck and cover. We got trained to, understand, if there's a nuclear war, you go to these places, civil defense sites. There were movies on like, what was it, the day after that, showed nuclear war on, network television and the impact of it. So it was a different environment, I think, and a different threat environment, and trained Americans in a different way than Australia. And living through 9/11, it's also something that, taught me that threats face America, major threats, even though it wasn't a great power. So I think that's a challenge. And in terms of extended nuclear deterrence, where were we in 2012? And, we can discuss where we are today next.
Yeah, so I remember being fairly confused at the, again, I finished up in 2012, because I remember in 2010, both South Korea and Japan asked for publicly acknowledged specific extended deterrence dialogues. I was just, I guess, surprised at the time that Australia didn't ask for the same kind of level of reassurance. It just struck me as odd. And where we are today, I'm not sure.
Yeah, publicly, I'm in the same place as you, which is South Korea and Japan have asked for additional reassurances and put out statements within the past, 6 to 8 months with the United States, joint statements that we stand together and an attack on one is an attack on all. So, and Australia never really asked for this. So, extended nuclear deterrence is a little bit more of a challenge. Now, there are things that could be said privately, but in my opinion, deterrence is a public game. You need to say these things publicly such that the people believe in it, because not only are you deterring leaders, you're assuring people as well.
Absolutely. And I think this goes to a much broader issue, is that, as you said before, the government is saying, supposedly we are in a deteriorated strategic environment, the worst since World War II, but there's no narrative behind that. What countries are you talking about? What do you mean? That the public narrative and discourse on Australia, the defense of Australia, is not there. And that, in my view, undermines fundamentally what you might call the social license around AUKUS.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. And I think there is just starting to be a discussion after the election on this topic. So, I've been to a couple conferences over the past 3 or 4 weeks where people have actually mentioned the fact that, there are nuclear threats out there and we need to be thinking about, nuclear deterrence as well as conventional deterrence. Richard Marles was speaking at a conference yesterday, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Defense. And he said, if the United States got into war over Taiwan with China, that Australia would probably be part of that war just by the fact that there are U.S. forces based in Australia. And I'm just paraphrasing from the newspaper article. I didn't actually hear the speech yet because it happened so recently. But that is kind of one of the first public things that I've seen on that specific topic, and telling the Australian people that, yes, there is a threat out there and it's associated with China, which is a key trading partner for Australia. And I think that's one of the challenges. Natalie, you probably saw the same article.
Oh, yeah, I did see the article. It's in the Australian. Yeah, it was the review. And he has acknowledged the fact that it's also around the whole Pine Gap issue as well. But I mean, essentially, Pine Gap should probably, because it's an NC3, part of the NC3 architecture, the whole idea of nuclear deterrence was that if there was an attack on such a structure, that the US would strike back at that country that attacked, say, Pine Gap. But that, I mean, people say that assurance and deterrence is two sides of the same coin, which I agree to an extent. However, for deterrence to work, there has to be no doubt in an adversary's mind that the US would respond to an attack on an ally. And Christine makes that point in one of her books. And the problem for US allies like Australia is that it's not quite clear that President Trump would respond. And at the moment, especially not considering Australia's keeps coming back out and saying that we're not going to increase our defence spending to 3.5% of GDP, as Secretary Hegseth has conveyed to Australia's Deputy Prime Minister on the margins of the Shangri-La dialogue. I mean, spending 3.5% on defence would be a whole ton easier if we could actually buy items off the shelf, a bit like Amazon, and it would arrive the next day. Unfortunately, there can be a long lead time on some of these military items.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, you raise a really important point, which is, does the U.S. president matter for extended nuclear deterrence? And there are probably differences between government and public opinion, but the Lowy Institute just released their polling numbers, and they polled the general public. And they said only 25% of Australians say that they have a lot or some confidence in Donald Trump to do the right thing in world affairs. And only 36% now trust the United States to act responsibly in the world. And that's a 20% drop from last year. So some things that Trump has done in terms of tariffs to Australia, some things that have been done in terms of this review on AUKUS, whatever it comes up with, have raised questions as to, is President Trump as committed to the region as President Biden was, and what's actually going to happen. And I don't think we've seen totally all the answers there just yet. But I think the president does matter in terms of assurances for extended nuclear deterrence on, the allied side. Whether it deters China as well or not is an open question to me. I'm not inside the Chinese leadership mind, but appreciate your thoughts on that.
I mean, if he comes across publicly, he's the commander-in-chief. He's the one that has to press the red button, right? Or give the command to press the red button. I mean, he needs to come across like he's going to press the button and not the Coke button that's on his desk.
Yeah.
Bridge Colby actually launched my first book back in 2015, so I'm confident.
Yeah, there is a very big difference between some people in the administration. There's the China hawks and those who want to live in peace and trade and, do tariffs and all those kind of things. So there is a question, but I think there is a point to where deterrence feels different under Trump than under Biden. We don't feel as reassured as the Australian public. Now, whether that comes across the same way under government or not is an open question. The government tends to be more stable on these things and think of things in terms of long-term relationships versus short-term political interactions. And there is a great deal of continuity between both sides of government here, both parties. So next topic, extended nuclear deterrence and the role of nuclear weapons in the Pacific versus in Europe. So, Europe, when we were thinking about NATO and the vast Soviet Union invading, the Western Europe, we were thinking about a land war and potential use of nuclear weapons to assist armies in terms of advances across the Fulda Gap and all that. How were people thinking about using nuclear weapons in the Pacific, Christine, in history? And we can talk about today as well, because I participated in a recent event that looked at some of this.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a fundamentally different theater of operations, and especially regarding Australia. Now, I'm no South Korea expert. I can't speak to the South Korean situation, but I can say when senior figures in the Australian government, so at the time we had the Australian Atomic Energy Commission, which was they were a strong proponent for Australia having a sovereign nuclear weapons capability because we could not rely on the Americans because they were not forthcoming on extended deterrence. One of the commissioners, Philip Baxter, he and Air Marshal Frederick Schurger, Chief of the Air Force at the time, personal hero, Team Air Force. He was saying there were debates about what an Australian nuclear weapons capability could look like. And so, unfortunately, the stuff in the National Archives is heavily redacted, which, that's fine. But I did glean some insights, and there was talk of, do we have tactical or strategic systems? And some people were saying, well, we only need to repel invading forces, so we only need short-range nuclear weapons. And then others were saying, well, if you're going to have quote-unquote tactical weapons, you may as well have strategic weapons in order to escalate or have the possibility of escalating against an adversary, i.e. the communist forces of China. But the challenges, again, it's not a land theater, it's maritime. It's not a NATO bloc, South Korea, Japan, and Australia each have their own individual alliances with the United States. So there never was that kind of where NATO had the nuclear planning group. We have discussions, multilateral discussions around the use of nuclear weapons, escalation, red lines, which are much easier to do, I would say, in a land context rather than a maritime context. So there was never a kind of a shared understanding in the Asia Pacific of what nuclear strategy is, what it could be,
Right.
and
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And in the Pacific, there's so few airfields, and airfields make such a good target against tactical or strategic nuclear weapons, or those nuclear weapons are a good weapon to attack those kind of targets. That makes things different, and also the fact that there's in some of these areas where they're talking airstrips on islands, there's little possibility for collateral damage, or less possibility for collateral damage as compared to Europe. It makes kind of the use of tactical nuclear weapons kind of inviting for a nation that has those capabilities.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And like, there's so much to write upon, like the logistics, just the logistics of force projection in the region. I've got a friend, an American friend, Robert Hill. He was a Cold War missileer, and he gave me this phrase, and I quote it when I can. Fuel. You can't kick ass without gas. Let's get more tankers.
Yeah, it's true. It's very true. And the range of aircraft matter. We could have a whole discussion on air power and range and, different versions and vulnerabilities of air power. And we'll probably get to that in the coming episodes. But yeah, the potential use of tactical nuclear weapons and their success rate in terms of this theater could be especially problematic for extended nuclear deterrence. How do you stop the use of those things? Is it, China may build a large tactical nuclear arsenal. What's the U.S. response? Do they counter that with the same kind of weapons? Do they deter with larger weapons? What is the answer there? I don't have a good one, but there is an open question there.
Carl, you and I differ on Slicker Man, I think. Please, your thoughts.
We do. I mean, there is a question of, do you buy tactical nuclear weapons, or do you invest more in conventional capabilities to deter that conventional conflict that would kick off the use of tactical nukes? And nuclear weapons are expensive. Let's not kid ourselves. They are effective, yes, and they're much more effective than conventional weapons, but they're also much more expensive. So, open question.
Open question.
Yep. So, I mean, this gets us to kind of a closing question here, which is, how do we assure deterrence against nuclear attack for Australia? Do we get better extended nuclear deterrence from the United States? Christine, I know you want to get some nuclear weapons for Australia. Natalie may too.
Yes.
What do you all think?
Natalie, your thoughts?
Well, given we have to look at the time frame of when we. Taiwan's come out saying that they think that this is going to happen before 2027, or at least be prepared for a Taiwan scenario before that time. So, looking at that time frame, I don't think we have time to start pulling apart the alliance. I think we have to work on the alliance. It's up to our leaders, like our Prime Minister, to have conversations with President Trump on this. He needs to get serious about extended nuclear deterrence and what that looks like, or needs to look like. And like I know Christine's sort of working on this, on how do you get to that future as well in the current environment, with some of her work looking at that regional balance. And then I think Christine probably has some ideas on what may need to happen in the short term around extended nuclear deterrence as well. Like, is that the planning groups? Is that, what actually needs to happen? But yeah, and we need to get on with putting money out into industry, enabling them to get on with building stuff and putting requirements, high level requirements, not the nth degree of detail. I mean, obviously you need your integration requirements, but we're speccing things out to the
Yeah.
I don't know. And AUKUS 2, they're saying that this is I know Peter Dean's come out saying that AUKUS 2 is looking for a problem. It's not. It actually is the future capabilities that we're going to need to make all of this more efficient. And some of these things that they can't see on the surface, like some of the suppliers that are 6 levels down, I happen to be one of those companies, if they don't get the money down to even that level, face huge issues in future. You need to release the funding. We haven't funded AUKUS 2. I've got a new article coming out on extending the Golden Dome and AUKUS Pillar 2 and how that needs to sit behind missile defence. I'm not a big fan of Star Wars, but let's at least get on with missile defence if that's what we're also going to do, because we need to integrate all that stuff, and we're going to need to be working with the US and the UK because we are enmeshed already. And they need to look at prioritisation of those capabilities, funding for those capabilities, and then getting on with it and dispersing the money out in the industry.
I mean, this is another approach to deterrence, which is defense, missile defense specifically. And Israel showed the value of missile defense in terms of denial of Iranian capabilities. Now, defending Australia is a much bigger place. It creates a challenge, much like the Golden Dome, but there are probably some point defenses that could be developed for specific locations. But that's another approach beyond building the nuclear weapons, potentially. Christine, I'll let you have the last word, and then we'll close up.
Thanks, mate. Look, there is value in missile defense, but I'm not a huge fan. And look, I stand by my views that Australia should have nuclear weapons because I don't buy extended deterrence as a concept, regardless of who's selling it. Frank Rose recently, former number 2 of the NNSA, he had an article out recently in Breaking Defense, and he made the great point. It's the perennial point that missile defense can help with concepts like damage limitation, but ultimately it's the offense that's going to deter. I mean, I think Australia's got it wrong. You can't just have deterrence by denial. Deterrence by denial is just defense. That's not deterrence. You need a bit of punishment. Let's get some punishment.
There we go. So we have denial and punishment. We'll leave you with those 2 words, and hope you enjoyed today's discussion and debate amongst the 3 of us around extended nuclear deterrence. I want to thank our listeners for tuning in today and encourage you to subscribe to the show and review the podcast. It's going to help others find us. And lastly, I want to remind you to always think deterrence.
Thank you for listening to Deterrence Down Under. Please take a minute to review the podcast, as your reviews help our podcast reach more listeners and expand the debate about strategic issues facing Australia and the region. Our show is made possible by the NIDS Podcasting Network, a division of the National Institute for Deterrence Studies. NIDS is a U.S.-based 501c3 organization that relies upon donations to produce this podcast and spread awareness of the peacekeeping value of U.S. strength, alliances, and deterrence. You can find a wide range of NIDS podcasts at thinkdeterrence.com. If you have any questions or feedback, feel free to send us an email at ddu@thinkdeterrence.com. I would like to thank our producer, Kimberly Charrington, and our sponsors, and all the amazing members of the National Institute for Deterrence Studies for making this podcast possible.
The NIDS Podcasting Network.